Arguments or reasoned persuasion. There are a couple of points we want to make about these. First is that you are going to present your arguments, or you're going to argue in order to influence opinions. Another one is you argue to elicit support. You're presenting your arguments and hoping that you can convince somebody to support your idea. You also want to remember to present your arguments anytime you present a proposal. You've got to talk your reader into agreeing with you, and the way that you do that is by making claims and supporting them. And then you also have, there are arguments that you are going to engage in when you're trying to change people's behavior. And that is kind of the hardest one. When people are already tending to agree with you on an issue, they're much easier to convince to take some kind of action. It's when they disagree with you that you really have to make that extra effort to convince them of something that is more of a challenge. As always, whenever we're writing this, whether it is a proposal or the homework assignment, you want to take your audience into consideration. One of the things you want to do is think about how the audience might react. If you're proposing that we put a landfill into a community area, think about what if that was happening in your area. Put yourself in that person's shoes and think about the things they might ask you or might think about you. Some of the things that your audience might be thinking when they read your paper is, what are you up to? Or why are you telling me this? Who are you? And what do you really want? Another strategy you want to do is think about what kind of resistance your audience might present. So think about all the things that they could argue with you. So put yourself again in their shoes. And remember that people who have not made up their minds yet are more receptive to your arguments or more receptive to your persuasion. But people who have made up their minds, that's a bigger battle. They will assume that they're right and they will be more resistant. So some of the strategies you want to use in order to convince or persuade your audience involve finding a way to connect to them. And there are three kinds of connections. The power connection is the one that a lot of people like to use, but it just doesn't work as well in some instances. Okay, in most instances. If you are the CEO of a really big corporation, maybe people will just take you at your word. Oh, maybe not. But the power connection is that you trying to connect with them by saying you should do this because I tell you to do this. And it's just not as strong of a connection. There's also the relationship connection. You always have liked me. And so if I propose something, surely you're going to agree with me on it. You know, it's that kind of, you build good relationships in the workplace. You find those people that you trust, and you sometimes follow their advice or fall for their persuasion, or they fall for your persuasion based on the fact that they trust you. It's one of those, if you really respect me, you'll do this. But the one that we would love to be able to do most of the time is a rational connection. And that is the one when you think about yourself and you think about your audience and you find those points of common ground. If you can convince your audience that I'm presenting this idea because it's good for me, but it's also good for you, then you've got the strongest connection of all. So you really want to try to make rational connections. To do this, some of the strategies you can do to enhance those connections, one of those is to allow for give and take. Don't just put your foot down and be forceful, but rather allow for some negotiation, some room for argument, some room for discussion. Another one is you do want to be very specific in asking for your response. Don't write a letter outlining a problem and then say thank you. Outline your problem, propose what you think their response should be, And then you have given them a direct path to follow, and they don't have to flounder around. They know exactly what you want from them. So be sure that you ask for a specific response. And then the last one is, don't ask for too much. Don't just ask and ask and ask. Because again, when you think about yourself in their shoes, it has that feeling that they are doing all the giving and you are doing all the taking. That's not a great way to build a relationship or to build a good connection. Some of the things you want to pay attention to when you're scoping out your letter or preparing your proposal is the different constraints there are, the different limits or boundaries. One of those is organizational constraints. And this is one that you just can't be taught from a book. Organizational constraints are those unofficial rules. They're not written down anywhere. You just have to learn them as you get into the organization. The strategy here is pay attention. Pay attention to what kinds of things are normal in your organization, what kinds of things work well. If you've got kind of an old-fashioned organization and they're used to the supervisor or the boss giving directions and everybody just follows those and responds very carefully, keep that in mind whenever you're presenting documents or you're preparing information or communications. If you're in an organization that's more family type and more give and take and they encourage input from everybody at all levels, keep that in mind. Use those strategies when you're preparing your communications. Don't forget about the legal constraints. There are just some things you cannot do. They're not allowed. There were a couple written here that are a bit interesting. First of all, you can't threaten to go public if somebody, say, for instance, doesn't pay their bill. That is against the law. You cannot do that. You will be the one that gets in trouble. You cannot pretend to be an attorney. So you might think, I think the best way I can convince them to pay this overdue bill is to tell them I'm going to take them to court. You have to be very careful with that stuff. You are not an attorney. You cannot misrepresent yourself as one. Again, you will be in trouble. The final one's kind of interesting. Even after an employee's quit, you just can't give out information that they haven't agreed to. So if an employee, for instance, gets fired from your company, and another company calls and asks for a recommendation, you have to be very careful about what you say. And generally, the best answer in that case is, I have no information to provide. I'm sorry, I cannot be of help. And then don't forget about the ethical constraints, and that is the business that it may not be strictly illegal for you to say or do something in your correspondence, but make sure it's the right thing to do. Be ethical. There are also time constraints. Sometimes you have to think about when is the best time to put out your persuasive document, your attempt to convince somebody, attempt to persuade somebody. For example, we were talking about the landfill. If somebody's going to put a landfill in your backyard and there is a new legislation coming out about that, you want to be careful about when you put your presentation out there to the public. So just be aware of time constraints. Should you wait? Should you go ahead and present your facts now? Think about those strategies as you're preparing. And then the last one is social and psychological constraints. And this is just the everyday business of interacting with other humans. Don't put somebody off. Don't get on their bad side. Don't complain and don't try to strong arm them. Try to think about that. This may be the golden rule thing. How would you like to be treated in this situation? You will have conversations. You will have interactions. You will have communications that are not comfortable, that are about something about which you disagree or that are problems. And you just have to learn how to do that in a professional manner and one that does not make enemies of your audience. Part of the goal of persuasion is to get this person to agree with your view. And so you're not going to do that if you make an enemy. Be careful about how you handle that other person.